5:40 in the morning, the house is completely still, and he's the only one up. He always is. The coffee maker hums low in the dark, and there he is, still in yesterday's undershirt, measuring the grounds the exact same way he's done it for 30 years now. Never a scoop more, never a scoop less. There's a mug on the shelf nobody else touches, not because he's ever said anything about it, but because everybody in that house learned better a long time ago. The toaster's older than his youngest kid and still works just fine, so it stays. Before he even sits down, he checks the front door. Locked. He checked it last night, too. In 20 minutes, he'll iron a shirt he's got nowhere to wear, just so it's ready. Out in the garage, every tool's hanging on its own hook, outline drawn in marker, so a missing wrench announces itself before anybody's even got to ask where it went. From the outside, a scene like that's easy to read. People who don't really know him already got a word ready for a man like this. Controlling, uptight, hard to live with, set in his ways to where nobody even bothers arguing anymore. The kind of man, people figure, who probably can't let anybody get close, because closeness would mean giving up a little of that order he spent his whole life building. But that reading might be missing the point completely. The world sees controlled. What it might actually be looking at is the first real say this man's ever had over anything in his whole life, and he's not about to hand that back easily. You know a man like this. Maybe it's your uncle, the one who shows up early at every family thing to help set up chairs, then slips out right when it starts winding down. Maybe it's your father, or that guy at work who never calls in sick, never asks for help carrying anything, even when his back's clearly bothering him. Everybody's got one, the relative who's loved deeply and understood barely at all. If you want to understand a man like that, you can't just ask him. You've got to look at the world he built when nobody was watching him build it. His house runs on rhythm. Sundays for washing the car, even in winter. Thursdays for the trash cans, out by 6, back in the garage by 7. His recliner sits at one specific angle, and if it gets moved even a couple inches, he'll notice before he's even sat down. He keeps the receipts for everything that ever mattered, filed by year, in a drawer nobody else opens, and somewhere in that house is an envelope of cash that only he knows about, just in case a bank or a card machine ever decides not to cooperate. None of this is about being difficult. It's about having, maybe for the first time in his life, a space where nothing gets taken and nothing gets rearranged without his say-so. If any of that sounds like somebody you know, stick around for a few minutes, because the next part is where this really starts to make sense. Because here's the bigger question. Why does that kind of quiet, private order matter so much to a man like him? Where does a need like that even come from? To understand it, you've got to go back to a house that wasn't his. Picture a 2-bedroom apartment, a grandmother, a mother, 3 or 4 kids, plus whoever needed somewhere to stay that year. Picture sharing a bed with your brother well into your teens, 1 bathroom and a line for it every single morning. The TV belonged to whoever got there first, and that usually wasn't him. The radio stayed on gospel most Sunday mornings, and grown folks' conversations went quiet the second a kid walked in the room, the way important things always seemed to. His mother and his aunts worked mornings, evenings, sometimes both, and responsibility for the younger cousins landed on him before he was even old enough to carry it, unlocking the door after school, starting dinner, keeping everybody quiet till a grown-up made it home. Now, not every household looked exactly like that one, but for a lot of black kids coming up in that decade, pieces of this story felt familiar. The shared beds, the extra kids nobody had to explain, one grown-up child watching over the younger ones. Outside, the block wasn't the one his mother grew up on. This was the 80s. Crack had already taken hold of whole neighborhoods, and porches that used to stay open past dark started locking up early instead. He learned which corners to avoid before he learned long division. And somewhere in a kitchen, a lot like the one he's standing in now, somebody sat him down and gave him the talk. Not about girls, about survival. How to keep his hands visible. How to answer a police officer without sounding like he was talking back. He was told more than once
that he'd have to work twice as hard just to be treated half as fair. And he believed it because he'd already watched it happen to the grown-ups raising him. When a kid grows up with almost no say over his own space, his own time, or his own safety, something shifts in how he understands control later on. It stops being about power. It becomes the closest thing he's got to rest. A locked door isn't paranoia to him. It's the first door in his life that was ever fully his to lock. A quiet, untouched hour in the morning isn't coldness. It's the only hour of his day nobody's asking him for anything. And this isn't just one man's story. Researchers who study health in Black communities actually have a name for this pattern of relentless, high-effort coping. They call it John Henryism, after the old folk tale of a steel driver who raced a machine, beat it, and dropped dead right after from the sheer strain of it. The scientist who came up with the term, a guy named Sherman James, found that same pattern showing up again and again in real people. Men working harder and harder against odds that never quite evened out, and their bodies quietly settling the bill for it later, a lot of the time through high blood pressure. Separately, researchers who study how Black parents raise their kids have found that most families pass down real specific messages about pride, about caution, about how to handle bias, not vague warnings, rehearsed, repeated instructions that eventually just become second nature. And historians looking back at that era say close to 4 in 10 Gen X kids came home from school to an empty house. For a Black kid in the 80s, though, an empty house wasn't just about a working parent. It was about a world that felt like it needed watching. Numbers like that'll tell you a pattern exists. They won't tell you what it looks like on an ordinary Tuesday. But you can see all of it in his daily life now if you know where to look. He's the one who drives 40 minutes to fix his sister's garbage disposal, instead of just telling her who to call. He'll send a cousin money without being asked and never bring it up again. At Thanksgiving, he's the one carving, and if you try to hand him a plate before everybody else has one, he'll wave it off without even looking up. He says, "I'm fine," so automatically that people stopped hearing it as an answer a long time ago and started hearing it as a wall. When his knee gave out last spring, he waited 4 months to say anything to anybody, and even then, only because his daughter noticed the limp herself. And that's really where we've got to be honest about what this can turn into if it goes too far. There's a real difference between a man who's built a life of order and a man who's quietly built a life where nobody's allowed to see him need anything. Independence starts out as protection. Left unchecked, it can turn into isolation. And the man living it is usually the last one to notice where one turned into the other. So the question was never whether his self-reliance is good or bad. The real question is where it stops protecting him and starts costing him. The problem was never that he needed control. The problem is when control becomes the only place he ever feels safe. The problem was never that he's strong. It's when strength becomes the only feeling he ever lets himself show in front of another person. So, if you're the one being described right now, here's what I want you to hear. Nobody's asking you to stop being the dependable one. That instinct kept you safe, probably kept people you love safe too for a long time, and it deserves respect, not correction. But you're allowed to put a few names on a short list, 2, maybe 3 people who'd actually notice if you went quiet too long, and who you'd let see you struggle without performing for them first. Let one of them fix something for you this year, even something small. Say, "I could use a hand," out loud at least once, and notice, the house doesn't fall down when you do. And if nobody's told you this in a while, needing somebody was never the weak part, it was only ever the human part. Because once you understand everything that came before it, that kitchen at 5:40 p.m. stops looking like distance. He's not locking that door because he doesn't trust the people on the other side of it. He's guarding the 1 hour of the day when nothing's required of him. The only hour that ever belonged to a boy who never had one of his own, now grown into a man who finally built a house quiet enough to give it back to him.